There we go. Lighting for effect. I've been building a shed. Stephen King once said, you need to remember that every character in a book is meaningful because they want something. They affect the story because they want something. And so, what I did was I just wrote down every character, a particular story that I'm writing, and then right next to it, wrote what they wanted. And I had never done that exercise before. It was interesting. I had a different perspective on the whole story. That was a very helpful exercise for me. I'm going to try implementing it into the stories that I've already written, see if anything new shakes loose. Well,
it's time for a story, it's time for a story, a very special story, especially for you.
And if you're dying, is a friend of mine. All right. This story's called The Toy Store Entanglement. Hector the Mouse lived in a toy store. Among the wooden ducks, rocking horses, yo-yos, Russian nesting dolls, Chinese checkers, display boards, decks of cards, figurines of animals and people, wooden puppets, and toy trains, Hector scurried, making sure none of his coat buttons became snagged as he squeezed and dodged his way between the different items. Jazz, the old cat, would watch Hector, talk with him, but never chase him, since the cat was just past his middle age. He knew the mouse didn't gnaw on toys, or the owner's clothing, or tear more than one hole in the wall, and only stole the crumbs that made it into the corners nobody ever swept. If one were to examine the unspoken enemies, one might almost believe Jazz and Hector were cordial to each other. On a rainy day, as Hector was looking his whiskers over in the reflection of a dollhouse's window, a customer walked in. Upon watching the customer's actions and muffled words, Hector detected that it was a relative of the owner. Over the human's perfume, Hector caught another scent. Dog. Hector's hair seemed to bristle right through his coat and vest as he dived behind a jar of marbles. The dog was scuffing around on the wooden floor with an umbrella, picking up Jazz's scent. Hector could see Jazz lounging on a shelf, smoking a pipe, his eyes nearly closed as the pupils rolled toward the dog on the ground. "Cat?" the dog growled his tense greeting to Jazz. "Jazz to you, pup," Jazz said coolly. "Then you'll call me Red, Tabby," the dog said, tapping his umbrella on the ground. Jazz mothered a and put his pipe back in his mouth. "I smell a mouse," Red said, looking about. "Have you gotten him yet? After all, it's your job." Jazz looked down at the dog. "Mouse? You'll have to forgive me, Red. I'm a bit older. My smell and reflexes have the acuity of a crooked sundial. Maybe there's a mouse. I wouldn't know." The pipe went back in his mouth and smoke flittered about his head. "You're less useful than the toys around you," Red growled, patting the umbrella in his hand like it was a baseball bat. "At least they have a use and don't need to eat." "You're worse than me, Red. Yapping about on the ground like that. Why not catch the mouse if you're so bothered?" Red gave a parting growl and started systematically sniffing around like a frantic lawnmower while Jazz watched with some interest. As Red looked for a scent, Hector sprinted about, hoping he would have enough time to cross the whole store and make it inside of his hole in the wall. Red would be here longer than most customers, since his owner knew the store's owner. Even if he hid underneath a shelf, Red could poke him out with the umbrella. "If only I didn't smell like a mouse. What a permanent giveaway," Hector lamented to himself. "Unless there was a way to smell differently." The dog was twirling his umbrella like a magician and turning the corner, about to search Hector's aisle. Fortunately, Jazz's worn cat bed was only a foot away. Hector zipped across the floor and leaped in. He began gathering all the cat hair he could, stuffing it into his coat. This ought to confuse the mongrel, he thought. The solution was itchy, like he had just donned a massive wool coat. He certainly smelled different. Hector whisked onto the shelf just above the bed and rattled behind a set of sailboats built inside of bottles. Red's head poked around the corner, and he trotted up to the bed. He inspected it with several sniffs and then eyed the shelf, eyes passing over the bottle Hector was pressed behind. Red's search moved on. Hector poked his head out again and could see Jazz perched on his shelf watching the whole ordeal. He smiled and lifted his pipe as if raising a toast. Hector watched Red move on and then scurried across the floor to a different shelf. The trick to escape is always being able to retreat. Hector kept this in mind as he ran up to the side of a workbench attached to Jazz's shelf, and once he made it to the top, he stopped to catch his breath. He passed and dodged between shelves until he came to the board games, some wrapped in brown paper for preservation, others on display since they were selling well. Hector hopped to another shelf next to him, which held wind-up toys, and stood among them, contemplating his next move, looking for the dog. Hector froze as a large, determined dog's face appeared in front of him. The dog eyes glanced over the mouse without much concern. Hector's breath held itself as his blood turned to ice, and he held his whole small body in place. Both dog paws held the umbrella's handle as he scowled over the toys. Then, miraculously, the dog moved on. Hector dared to move only a few seconds after the dog had left. The mouse looked around him and realized with a rush of joy that he looked quite in place among the surrounding toys. Hector sneaked across the last few feet of floor and stopped under the register's ledge, watching the dog stand next to his master nearby. Just next to the dog was a shelf that hid his hole in the wall. The dog held his umbrella behind his back and leaned close to the shelf, facing away from the sweating mouse. Hector's mind raced, looking for something with which to distract the dog. He saw 2 pennies close to his feet and picked one up. He spotted movement in the corner of his eye and looked up. Jazz had taken a new seat, seemingly invested in Hector's plight across the toy store, and came to watch the climax. The cat gave another small, unsettling smile, holding his pipe in his paw without smoking it just yet. Hector narrowed his eyes at the cat and wound up the penny. He bowled the coin across the wood floor, and it made a sharp mumble like someone was dragging an inkless pen across paper. Red's ear perked. Hector dodged out of view as far from where he was standing, and Red used his umbrella as a cane as he marched toward the penny's departing point. Successfully away from the hole, Hector sneaked behind the nosy dog while his heart was skipping beats like the world's worst musician. Right before he entered his house, he faced the dog's back and said, "Yeah, smarty, smarty, smarty," and jumped into his hole in the wall while Red's whole body started, and he turned to see the tip of Hector's tail whisk under the shelf obscuring his house. Red fell to all fours, and his head bobbed around, looking under the shelf. He pounded the floor with his paw and hurled a chuckle from above. He looked up to Jazz, whose inscrutable face lazily disappeared from view. Red stood up, dusted himself, and held his umbrella. "Those 2 are up to something," he quietly concluded. The end. That was last week's syrup, and this is this week's syrup.